Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 15 Food Consumption in the USA. So, our food patterns have changed a great deal over the past few centuries. Convenience foods and outlets that never existed before boomed in popularity. This chapter, we focus on changes in the past few generations, mostly since the 1970s. So here are the learning objectives for the chapter. In no particular order, we're going to kind of dash around. And to start here, talk about choices that shape the food system. So there's a feedback loop. Whatever the public is consuming more of, the food industry will attempt to provide. So your decisions send a signal back to the entire food industry about what is popular and likewise what is not popular. So as food trends come and go, the food industry responds. And likewise, the food industry also attempts to influence the public's choices based on where their investments can bring back the most profit. An example is bananas. What first began as a small specialty crop imported into a few ports in the American South gradually grew in popularity in the early 20th century. People liked bananas. They also happened to ripen fairly slowly. They were a good crop to ship. And the food industry responded by investing in bigger plantations in Central America and the Caribbean, sturdier varieties of bananas, and more marketing. Later in the post-World War II economy, interest picked up in convenience foods as more women began working and the pace of life became a little bit faster. People had less time to cook, and the food industry responded by making more processed foods that were easy to prepare, and also, like we saw in the previous slide, more fast food options. Another example of how food choices shape the food system would be our breakfast. A lot of people enjoy a cup of coffee with sugar with their breakfast. It's interesting to think that these two foods were very uncommon prior to the 18th century and really didn't become common until the 20th century. So now sugarcane covers over 65 million acres of land, and a dozen countries use at least 25% of their farmland to grow it. Similarly, coffee is a massive global crop. 26 million acres are filled with coffee plantation. And these two foods are examples of dramatic changes in dietary habits. These just simply weren't common foods until relatively recently. By the early 20th century, the rapid increase in their consumption completely changed the economies of well over a dozen countries, including nearby countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, Haiti, Cuba, Mexico, Dominican Republic. And the diets in those countries also changed. Those two foods had never been consumed in those countries prior to the 18th century. Interesting, both coffee and sugarcane are native to the Mideast, to areas like Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Northern Africa, where coffee was first consumed widespread, and sugarcane from nearby that area in India. And now, these are daily staples. So food choices and trends change all the time. This is an example of a fairly consistent trend over the past 100 to 300 years, but again, this could shift, right? So there are many factors that influence food choices. And to kind of continue with our breakfast and coffee theme, Starbucks is a classic example. There were no common coffee drinks, things like lattes and frappuccinos, in the US until the 1980s. Hard to believe, right? Because they're so much part of our culture today. And coffee was first quite expensive in the 18th century when it was a relatively rare luxury good. It gradually got cheaper by the 20th century, and it became a pretty cheap commodity, and then to some degree went full circle when it became more of a proprietary good with high-end coffee retailers like Starbucks and Peet's Coffee. And if you go back even further, the Boston Tea Party back in 1773, before the Revolution, turned coffee drinking into a political act, as the British controlled, who are colonial masters, they controlled the tea trade and were taxing tea, so drinking coffee was a way of declaring independence from Britain. So food has a lot of different meanings, and the trends happen for many different reasons. The roles of food are quite different for humans than any other animals, because if you think of other animals, they have their ecological niche and they only eat foods local to them. So, for instance, koala bears are famous for only eating eucalyptus leaves. Squirrels eat nuts, trees, flowers, and buds. Human beings are very different. We're generalists, as ecologists would call us. We adapt the environment to us using tools as opposed to our biology adapting to the environment. We're the only animals that eat foods outside of our home areas, and we often eat food for non-nutritional reasons. So we're eating food for comfort, pleasure, sometimes even the mind-altering possibilities of the foods for different cultural, social, religious reasons. And of course, we all want to live long and productive lives, and the food we can eat can be powerful tools in helping us achieve that. So we'll consider that as we go along in this chapter and semester. So what do Americans eat? There are many different ways to look at this, and this is a very general look, but here we're looking at the My Plate, the dietary recommendations that we've had for the last decade or so, which is a good basic suggestion for eating patterns. And if we look at that, we're not really following the My Plate, because the average American eats very few fruits and vegetables, only 8%. And you can see the recommendation is that that takes up close to 50% of our diet, right? And you can see we're eating quite a bit of grains, and when we say grains, foods made out of grains. So it could be a lot of refined foods in that category. And very importantly, our calorie intake has increased a great deal. So up 24% from 1961. And in the book, I believe they cite another number from the late 70s, up about 20%. But the trends are pretty clear. We're eating a lot more. And this is a big increase when you consider activity levels have fallen. We have less active work, we have more sedentary work, a lot more technical work, less factory and farm work, less physical labor. So this is part of what contributes to our rising weights and chronic disease. So diving a bit more into what Americans eat, you can see that the grains, we're not talking about things like barley and brown rice and quinoa. We're talking about processed foods made from grains, cakes and pies and muffins and donuts and that kind of thing. The mixed dishes can refer to a lot of things, but often processed foods, pizza, macaroni and cheese, that kind of thing. With the protein foods, we eat close to about double our dietary needs. So if anything, we're probably doing a little bit too much on those ends, and mostly from animal sources, which is really different than many countries around the world, where they're getting most of their protein from legumes, things like beans, split peas, also some from nuts and seeds. Here you can see some of the influences of parents here. Encouraged to push dairy on kids for the benefits for bone growth, for bone strength with the calcium, and who is eating the most fruits and vegetables. So parents trying to get their kids to eat healthy, um, although the amounts are really low overall. And you can see once the kids have a degree of autonomy, teenagers, they tend to consume less fruits and vegetables. And also, just to mention there, potatoes are the most consumed vegetable, and they're in that category botanically, but really when you get into nutrition science, potatoes don't have much in common with the fibrous vegetables, things like broccoli and cauliflower and tomatoes and spinach. Potatoes really are nutritionally more similar to grains. So Americans are doing pretty poor on the vegetable category. Here you can see snack foods, which a lot of high sodium, high sugar foods that have low fiber content and low overall nutrient content. And with the beverages, a lot of calories coming from beverages, which contributes quite a bit to the obesity and chronic disease issue, as we don't fill up, we don't feel satiated from liquid calories the way we do from solid calories. So a 200 calorie soda doesn't fill you up the same way as 200 calories of low fat yogurt with blueberries. I also would talk to my patients quite a bit about, hey, the advantages of drinking water. Not only better for your health, but you can save a lot of money. So the textbook talks about how food consumption is calculated, and one simple way is just by measuring the production of all the commodities, then subtracting from that what we're exporting and what is going for animal feed. So, for instance, a lot of the corn and soy produced in the US goes directly to animal food, so that's not involved in human consumption. And then also accounting for food waste, which is about 40%. It's a really large amount. Then to get the most accurate numbers on food consumption, you really have to do assessment at the individual level. And NHANES, which is a national survey, is where we get a lot of data about what Americans eat. And up there, I threw up an example of a food frequency questionnaire, although the real best tool for determining what people eat is what's called a 24-hour recall, which I used to do all the time in clinical settings. You just ask the patient, tell me everything you ate and drank yesterday from the moment you got up to the moment you went to bed. And this is often done with food models. So the interviewer will hold up like a plastic food model of a steak and say, was it this big? A glass of juice, was it this big, to make sure it's as accurate as possible. So the NHANES survey, which I just mentioned, that's both done by phone and in person. They have a pretty large team of people that travel around the country in big RVs and meet people person to person and interview people in a lot of detail, collect a lot of amazing information, and that really helps the government form public health guidelines and goals. For instance, what you read about in the book about our fiber intake being quite low and several nutrients, right, like calcium, potassium, and some nutrients being too high, like sodium. The DRIs, of course, are the dietary reference intake. So that's what helps form the major group of guidelines that we give to the public. So as an example of some of the trends here, we can see that there's been an increase in calories over the last, between 1977 and 2007. There's been a little bit of a drop in fat, increase in carbohydrates. Some of that is due to a shift from a lot of beef, cow products to more chicken products. So the chicken products are a little bit lower in fat. Also some other dietary habits with things like butter and sour cream becoming a little bit less common, and more carbohydrates because just a lot more snack foods. So you have to kind of dig into the data. If you just look at the data itself, you could think that people went back to eating whole grains and legumes, and that's why carbohydrates increased and fat dropped. But fat drop sounds good, and it is probably good, but the increase in carbohydrates is not complex carbohydrates like whole grains, legumes, and vegetables. It's simple carbohydrates. So this is examples of other food consumption data that has been collected, and yeah, almost all Americans are below the DRIs for potassium, fiber, vitamins D and E, and above the DRI for sodium. And when I look at this, I think the most telling information there is the fiber. And we're consuming, I believe it's a little bit below half the recommendations. And that points to low intakes of vegetables, because vegetables per calorie are the best source of fiber. Not grapefruit intake, which also can have a fair amount of fiber, few whole grains, which has fiber, and a lot of processed foods, which doesn't have much fiber. Fiber really helps you make you feel full, and it's very good for the digestive tract, essential for the digestive tract. So a lot of chronic disease begins with low fiber diets. This is another one of the major trends spotted over the previous decades, and that has continued to today. I know you're looking at this and thinking this is a little bit out of date, but this graph actually goes up to 2021, so not too bad compared to some of the other ones, and quite an increase in food eaten away from home. If you think food in any kind of sales setting, commercial setting, their goal is to produce as tasty a food as possible for as the lowest expense, right? So they're going to focus on not on health. So the food's generally going to have a fair amount of salt, a fair amount of fat in it, not a lot of vegetables, not a lot of fiber, and there are implications for health there. I would always tell my patients the most important single piece of health advice I could give you is a 4-letter verb, COOK, cook. Cook at home. And you'll also save money. When you get a chance, think a little bit about how does your diet compare to the My Plate guide? Do you eat a quarter plate of vegetables 3 times a day? Are you eating a modest amount of protein? Are you eating a fair amount of fruit? Or does your diet look a little bit more like some of the diets we've talked about recently? More processed foods, liquid calories, high sodium foods like pizza, and foods from restaurants. This dives into some of the specifics from the My Plate, the government's general healthy eating plan. And think a cup is about like your balled up fist or a baseball. So it's not a huge amount, but still we're not meeting the fruit amount, and we're certainly not meeting the whole grain amount. We're meeting the grain amount, but it's mostly refined grains. And you can see, 4 ounces is about the recommendation for most adults. And that's about half a cup or half a fist or baseball. And we eat plenty of refined grains and processed foods, but not a whole lot of whole grains. You can think brown rice versus white rice. People tend to prefer the refined grains like white rice. They cook a lot quicker, they taste sweet, they don't have that kind of chewy, grainy flavor, but they also don't have the fiber and are missing out on some vitamins and minerals as well. And here's where the big gap is with the vegetables. A lot of my patients hardly ate vegetables, and when it was vegetables, it was potatoes. Potatoes and corn, and corn's really a grain, but they would report that as vegetables. And I would tell my patients, eat your fruits and vegetables, then they just eat fruit. They don't eat the vegetables because fruit is sweet. You can eat it raw, you don't have to cook it. It's a lot harder to promote vegetable eating. You have to clean, cut up, often cook the vegetables. One thing I would tell my patients is go ahead and buy frozen vegetables if you don't want to deal with the vegetables. They're already cut up, they're already cleaned. You just have to cook them, which isn't too hard. In these categories, on average, Americans are doing fine or even excessive in the protein and dairy departments. I throw this just kind of up here for fun. This is a little bit dated in terms of the financial numbers because the book was published almost 20 years ago. But comparatively, looking around the world, you can see what those numbers, those ratios are still fairly accurate. This is a great book, beautiful visuals in this book. You can look here at the US, one classic family, a whole lot of processed foods, a lot of bagged foods, a lot of snack foods, a lot of sweets. Another family in the US, a little bit more of a whole foods diet, but yeah, still a whole lot of canned and processed foods, and of course some pizzas or frozen pizzas and Ritz crackers and all of that. And another version from the US, kind of similar. Going to Germany, it starts looking a little bit more whole foodsy, but still pretty processed. Japan, a whole other kind of a diet. You can see a bit more seafood there, a decent amount of fruits and vegetables, but also a fair amount of processed foods. Australia, looking a little bit more wholesome there. Great Britain, kind of similar to the US now. Turkey, ooh, now we're getting into some more traditional diets where you see really a lot of whole foods. You're seeing some legumes and grains there as well. A lot of home cooking probably. Again, Egypt, very non-Western diet, a lot of whole foods there. Ecuador, a little similar to Guatemala, and there's not a single packaged food there, right? Big bags of probably beans, some other grain that might be rice, some potatoes, various fruits and vegetables. Very little meat and dairy, partially because they're really quite a bit more expensive in most of the developing world. And look how low the food cost is. They're doing a lot of the cooking right there at home. And just a little review on the healthy dietary guidelines. This is a video worth checking out. You can check the link on the PDF on the D2L site. And that's all we have for this chapter. And as always, make sure you read the chapter. The video is just a kind of additional help way to study, and reach out to myself or the preceptors with any questions. Thanks for watching this.